Rated XDR, some content may not be suitable for legacy security vendors. We kick it off today with CrowdStrike on Son of a Breach. Few players in the security space have seen more post-IPO success than CrowdStrike. They've truly been a marketing machine that backs up their presence with solid technical capabilities and a vision. Their recent acquisition of Humio and Preempt has brought a ton of additional capabilities to a pretty already well-appointed portfolio. And to talk about their approach to security, I'd like to welcome the former founder and CEO of Preempt and the current VP of Identity Protection, Ajit Sancheti. Ajit, thanks for joining.
Thanks, Randy. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's kick it off real quick with a brief history in your background of security.
Well, I started in security when in 2000, when managed services, security services were in the infancy, and we were spending a lot more money than we were bringing in. And around that time, our investors came and said to us, okay, we're going down unless you can show that you can build a product company, especially as the dot-com implosion was happening. So we exploded, and then we came up with we built the first commercial IPS at the time, the intrusion prevention system. And really doing that at that time, because the intrusion detection systems were so noisy, was really a leap of faith for us to expect our customers to deploy something at the perimeter that was blocking. So we went on to do that. 9/11 happened. Security became top of mind for everyone. And very subsequently after that, OneSecure, the company I was at, got acquired by NetScreen. And NetScreen started to build the first multifunction gateways. And then multifunction solutions like Palo Alto, like Fortinet, all of those solutions happened around that time. It started with that understanding that firewalls were not sufficient. They needed to do more. And so stateful firewalls. And so it's been interesting. We started building that market. And then I went off and they said, okay, what's next in security? And we started looking at security technologies for testing. And with another co-founder of mine, Kaushik Guruswamy, who went on after me, we started Mu Dynamics. We looked at using fuzzing technologies to apply that to communication protocols. Again, well ahead of its time, but now we can see fuzzing showing up everywhere at the application layer also. So I feel vindicated. That company was acquired by Aspire Communications. I took a break, and then I went back and I said, okay, if we did this IDS IPS transition at the perimeter, what's next with that kind of an approach? And in 2014, Randy, as you may recall, the CEO of Target was fired when they had a breach. And it was the first time a non-security person felt the impact of a security breach. And so it became clear that security was going to become top of mind. And what we asked ourselves is, how do we bring in the level of security we're bringing to the perimeter to the inside of the corporate network? And that led to the creation of Preemption Security, which then became focused on identity-centric approaches to security, not just access. And that, as you saw in the last 12 to 18 months, has become so important with remote work. And we became part of CrowdStrike because zero trust requires a combination of identity and endpoint. Again, it's been an amazing ride for me just to see the creation of 3 different markets, but never a dull moment. And I think it's going to stay that way.
Yeah, and apparently always ahead of your time. I mean, Preempt, I was a huge fan of Preempt. Very unique enforcement point, very unique point to be implemented into the security stack, just sitting on top of Active Directory instead of trying to have a out-of-band proxy that you have to route authentications through or trying to sniff off the wire. Actually sitting on the domain controller was a unique way of doing things. And now, like you said, the last 12 to 18 months have been about nothing but identity. So again, shooting ahead of the curve, with folding into CrowdStrike, what role did they see you guys playing in their very endpoint centric strategy up to that point?
So you brought up a really interesting point, right? Why did we choose identity? Why did we choose Active Directory? Active Directory has 20 years in an enterprise. It's a mess, but it's also the place where all identities are stored. And if you look at breaches, 4 out of 5 breaches have something to do with credential compromise. And if someone's trying to get the credentials, it's Active Directory that they want to compromise. And, when Active Directory was first built, there was a lot of assumptions around trust, which we lost as the network perimeter went away. So we started to build these solutions. We were trying to tell the market that, hey, identity is not about access. Identity is about access and security. It took a little while to get there. But to your point about what CrowdStrike saw, around the time of COVID and just, during the start of COVID, George Kurtz, our CEO, was talking to customers, and he talked to a lot of customers over a period of 100 days. And what they heard was remote work and identity. And those were the things that customers really cared about, because controlling the identities were getting harder and harder. We now talk about this as zero trust. It took Kinderwald, when he was at Forrester, 10 years to get this to become mainstream. He's ahead of his time. But now everybody's understanding that it's not just the endpoint that you care about. It's the endpoint, it's the network, it's the workloads, and it's the identity. And that really led CrowdStrike to say, okay, is there a possibility of a union? I couldn't be more excited, because I think the fit of our architecture with the core CrowdStrike Falcon platform is just seamless, and we're starting to see the benefits of it.
Yeah, it definitely fills some gaps in not just visibility, but also control, which I think is very unique, and customers are starting to circle around to it. Gartner came out with their triad, and they emphasized endpoint, network, and logs. And as soon as that came out, I immediately looked at it and thought, well, it depends on where you're getting the logs from, because that's a bit of an ambiguous term. But what I really think the focus is on endpoint, identity, and applications, whether they're SaaS, cloud, whatever. And CrowdStrike is definitely moving towards that fashion. I mean, they can audit the software that's installed on the endpoint. Now you can look at the different user interactions with that software, who's logging in, what their risk factor is, and then kind of bake that into whether or not they should have a certain level of access to a machine or on a machine. So it's really coming through into a much broader picture for both visibility and enforcement.
Yeah, no. So let's look at an example of something that everybody cares about right now, ransomware, right? Mm-hmm. When you think about ransomware, the ransomware gets in first, and the first place to detect it is processes on the endpoint. Now, let's assume that the ransomware is smart and you've not been able to detect it. The next thing that the ransomware has to do to be really effective is try to do lateral movement, try to get to a file server. There, it's all about credentials and where the credentials are being used. So with this approach that we've taken at CrowdStrike with the Falcon platform, for the simple example of ransomware, we can detect it first at the endpoint. Well, let's assume it's not a managed endpoint, but there's a credential there that's being used to move laterally. Well, we'll detect it at the identity layer. And so that's really our goal, is to be able to help enterprises detect it. That's part one. Part two of that, and Zero Trust talks about, is conditional and risk-based access. The trick there, and I think the important thing to remember there, is just because I can challenge you, I shouldn't. Because if I keep doing it, employee productivity is going to go down, the user experience is going to be poor. So what you're going to have to do is to focus a lot on frictionless Zero Trust, which is I only challenge you when I have to. So 99% of the users who are doing something that's normal, never changing, doesn't get impacted, their behavior hasn't changed, you probably don't want to challenge them. But when something suspicious happens, you need to confirm whether it's just suspicious or if it's suspicious and malicious. And that's really that's going to be key for a good Zero Trust solution. And it's going to be a long journey. Zero Trust is not simple. There's just so many components to it.
Yeah, and there's very few very few organizations that actually have the appetite to implement Zero Trust. Because like you said, there is an element of user acceptance that's hard to get buy-in on unless they really see the benefits of security. And when you're continuously prompted and challenged for another factor of authentication, it gets to be annoying really quickly.
Yeah. Somebody used a phrase and said it's not multi-factor authentication, it's multi-fatigue authentication. And I said, wow, that's probably right. If we're going to keep challenging users, the fatigue is going to get to them. Yeah, you're right. I think though, and it's very important for enterprises as they think about Zero Trust, to think about it as a journey. And you can start wherever you are most comfortable and strong, right? Your investments, you've made so many investments. You could start at the endpoint and build the identity in the workload layers, or you could start at the identity layer and build out the other components, the network layer, because there's different ways to start. And so what I've been telling customers and what we've been telling is you start out with visibility, then you get to and unify the visibility so you can reduce your attack surface. Then you get to the threat detection part, and the threats could be like things like ransomware or credential compromise, supply chain attacks. Then the third phase is really true conditional risk-based access for your user groups. Just because you can get to your users, don't do that. try to get the first bit of visibility and then the threats before you start to hit the conditional risk-based access, because you're not going to do yourself any favors if you have all these stale service accounts sitting in an environment that you didn't know about.
Yeah, I mean, crawl, walk, run methodology is always advisable, but if you can do some level of assessment first to kind of clean your house before you start organizing the junk that you have inside of it, it's definitely a much smoother implementation process once everything is documented and cleaned up. You've mentioned zero trust quite a bit, and I want to talk about the more recent acquisition from CrowdStrike of Humio, because that plays more into XDR. So when you look at CrowdStrike's vision, is zero trust and XDR two pieces of the same story? Are they two separate things? What's really the focus of CrowdStrike?
So the basic thought there is that we are getting hit by very sophisticated attackers, right? The attacks that are coming so often, the CrowdStrike team, the IR, incident response team that goes in and tries to do any kind of incident response at a place that's been breached and we've been called in, is there's no telemetry. And the telemetry that you need to figure out what happened just doesn't exist. And the reason is people just cannot afford, there's exponential data growth. I think right now organizations are saying that unstructured data is doubling every 40 months, right? So you have so much data, you have complexity, so you don't store it. You have complexity, you have budget pressures, you have legacy data. All of that is there, and that data doesn't exist when you need to do incident response. So when we started thinking about incident response, we said, well, if we want our customers to be able to get a good handle of understanding indicators of attacks, the IOAs that we talk about, you're going to need good telemetry. And if it's all based on doing via Splunk, I mean, you need an unlimited budget as the data grows, right? And so what Humio gave CrowdStrike the ability to do is to log everything and answer anything, which is really the tagline. Right? If you can log everything in real time, then you can answer the questions that you need in real time. And that's really what drove CrowdStrike to doing it. Now, that does not mean that it's a replacement for a SIEM. And you and I can probably discuss that in many different ways, right?
Oh, and we will.
But I think that the ability to have something that's index-free, that's cloud native, it's real time, it gives ingest data, allows you to redefine XDR in a manner that says, okay, well, let's go find the data sources that really matter, rather than saying, like a SIEM, let's bring in all the data, and don't consider this to be a SIEM next generation. Think of it more as a security use cases. What are the security use cases we're trying to solve? How do we want to solve it? Does it get expanded over time to compliance or something like that? That's a good question. But at this time, our focus is on building it so that it answers security use cases. Also, I think that, if you look at the CrowdStrike store, we have so many good partners that do so many great things that we won't do. Email security. You look at the partners that we have, Proofpoint and Momcast, we have so many. And then you look at Illumia. You look at, so many partners that we have there. They do things really well. So we want to bring in those indicators into our platform and give the customers the ability to bring it. And that's how we want to leverage XDR. So we can get to the point where we can solve these questions, not just by CrowdStrike's native data, which we have so many different ways. We have over 19 modules now. But then with the partners that we work and the industry itself, really focus on the security use cases.
Now let's dive in real quick to that whole SIEM XDR piece. You claim XDR is more about the security use cases, whereas SIEM is more about collecting a lot of things. And I think that's what the security industry has grown accustomed to. But the idea of SIEM could easily have the strategy of let's solve security use cases inside of SIEM without collecting everything. So it seems like a slight nuance between your thoughts behind XDR and the current state of SIEM, which I don't think anybody would argue is broken.
Yeah, I think it also has to do with the fact that the kind of data that you can bring into SIEM, so much about SIEM is being structured, right? You have the right log formats, you have the right way you bring the data in. And so much about the data we generate these days is not structured, and nobody has the time to build it. So maybe the way to think about it is the data sources are leading to the change in how you build the solution. If you have to go back and re-architect your SIEM to handle unstructured data fast in a more real-time manner, in a more cost-effective manner, you can probably get there. But I think it's a heavy lift for the current legacy vendors to do that. It's probably going to be harder than I don't argue with you, right? The difference between security and compliance is who's paying your budget, really. Who's paying the money for the tool? And ultimately we build the viewpoints and the data that we need from a compliance standpoint, or hopefully from in more real time for a security solution. So I don't argue with you, but I do think that the way and the amount of data and the kind of data you bring in with XDR, if you're not careful, you'll end up with another SIEM mess.
Now, the original reason for SIEM was exactly what you said. Let's log everything. That way we can retroactively do advanced investigations. And then it became, well, we have this data in one place. Why don't we do detections? And we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but does a properly implemented XDR platform replace a SIEM?
It depends on the use cases. I hesitate to answer that question because I think that we have a long way to go before you start to say, oh, yeah, you can get rid of your SIEM and now the XDR platform will do everything for you. Mm-hmm. I think it's a long way before we get there. Also because you have to unravel all the things you've done with the SIEM for so long. It's going to take time. I think it goes back to Chris Christensen's innovator's dilemma, right? You're solving some of the easier use cases, but I think over time, they will start to pick up the more complex, the more comprehensive use cases. And then the SIEM vendors may have to decide whether they co-opt or get replaced in an organization. I think that journey is it's going to be a little while. At this point, the challenge of just getting really good telemetry for security use cases is compelling enough for XDR. You can see how Gartner's talking about it. I can, even as you look at Critical Start, I mean, you guys do so much of this, and you do it in a more modern way than the legacy solutions do.
I definitely agree. I mean, the whole tagline for this XDR series is, rated XDR. Some content may not be suitable for legacy security vendors. There's definitely going to be a lot of catch-up work to do for some of these vendors that have been either only looking at their own data for telemetry, or they don't have a backend that will support the ingestion of third-party data for additional telemetry. I do think eventually, and this may be the wrong way to think about it, I do think eventually XDR will replace SIEM because it seems like the mission statement behind XDR is to accomplish what we really wanted to get out of SIEM, which was how do we lower dwell time of an attacker in the environment.
Right.
We just got sideways when everybody said, well, I can collect everything. Yeah, but you don't need everything. You need the specific telemetry pieces that help you do the investigation more quickly. And when you start collecting everything, you get lost in the possibilities or potential. So I'm definitely on board with that. And the primary driver to me and talking to customers seems to be compliance for SIEM.
Right. Exactly. That's part of the challenge. We started focusing too much on compliance than security. Right. That I think is probably one of the mistakes we made as we started to do it. But it's not. You can't blame them, right? When you have a compliance requirement show up, you have to solve it. Mm-hmm. But to say, hey, that doesn't solve a security problem. I think we as an industry have to go back and say, which of these compliance use cases are still relevant? Why are people doing it? Do we have the right controls? I have great examples of some financial organizations that we work with where they went in and they were asked to identify all their service accounts and make sure they were being used correctly. Now, we were able to generate that report for them and give it to them, but nobody asked them, okay, what are those controls on those service accounts? Mm-hmm. You just tell me which service accounts you have. Great, here's my report. But what are those accounts doing? I think you should care more about that. So we answered your question. Here's a report you asked for, but nobody asked and said, why do we have so many? And what are they doing?
Yeah, actually quoting Jason Robaum, it comes down to, do you have a compliance auditor or a compliance assessor? Compliance auditor is just checking boxes, but an assessor wants to understand the intent behind the control and make sure that you're actually meeting that intent. So I'm hoping that in the longer term, XDR becomes a mitigating control for a SIEM, because I do think that XDR, given potentially more limited data feeds, but maybe more meaningful data feeds, will fulfill the actual intent behind the control for SIEM, which is if you have a breach, if you have some insider threats, you need to be able to identify those, respond to those, and do root cause analysis on top of it.
I see, and that's going to come now more because many of the CISOs that have taken the roles of CISOs in the last couple of years were practitioners.
Yes.
It's so when you're a practitioner, you're going to have more of a security viewpoint. And I think that's going to help change. And I think that's what's going to drive an XDR approach. Doesn't matter where how you bring it, whether through a traditional SIEM or through a new next generation solution. But because practitioners are taking roles in organizations, that's going to drive it. And I think we're going to be better off.
I agree. And that's a shift that I think everybody's been seeing as practitioners starting to get up into the leadership levels instead of leaders that have migrated from other verticals of IT. And that's going to make a monumental difference. I want to go back to zero trust because that seems to be an underlying message of CrowdStrike. How does CrowdStrike view XDR's ability to enable zero trust, or where do those two things play together? You kind of alluded to XDR being a retroactive way to look through a bunch of different log sources to quickly get to root cause analysis and identify attackers. But how does an XDR platform enable a zero trust approach?
It's a good question. I think they're somewhat complementary because one of the challenges with zero trust is you want real-time data, right? And if you look at any kind of logging solution, it's near real-time or as close to real-time as possible, but it's not real-time. So the way you can look at that is there are some. Let me take an example of a user. In zero trust, a user is very important. What I want to know about the user is, what are they doing now? Are they trying to do an authentication request to an application they've never done, coming from an endpoint I haven't seen them come from before? But that tells me what they're doing now. But what I also want to know is what else that user's done. And there's a lot of behavioral machine learning things that happen there. And that's where I think XDR helps us, is get a better and a more comprehensive view of the user over time, keep that updated. And so we always have that view of that user historically. Because then you can start to do things like, okay, this user is so predictable, nothing has changed, and suddenly this is new. We know that because we've looked at the history and we've seen the score change over time. But because the risk score is, let's say, 8 out of 10, which is high risk, we're going to force an MFA. It would be very hard for us to do that if we didn't have some of the historical data on that user. And that's how I think they will come together. Because again, the thing about data is the 35th, 36th data source is giving you only incremental benefit, but it's giving you more noise. So that you have to find out where the signal to noise ratio, you have to be very careful about that. And we made this mistake with UEBA 5 years ago, where we said, let's put every data source we can. And then it took us a lot of time to figure out, okay, what's the signal? What's the noise? And if we get better, and we will, you pick fewer data sources that are high fidelity, you'll do better. And I think XDR will help us do that.
Now let's define the XDR. I mean, because what we've been talking about seems like it's accomplishable with a in-depth integration to a SIEM and a lot of good endpoint telemetry. So when you think about XDR and when you look at how CrowdStrike is approaching the problem, how does CrowdStrike define XDR?
So for us, we're doing it in a manner that we think is meaningful for our customers, meaning, we have so many data sources, the CrowdStrike data sources that we bring in. And so often the cost of storing all that data for our customers is very high with the legacy approaches of SIEM. And so in our XDR, we cared about having a solution that can ingest everything and doesn't continually increase the cost for the customer. So for us, being able to get that security data in, not just from us, as I mentioned, from our partners, from the other industry sources, because we're not the experts in everything, bringing that data in, the advantage of being index-free, the advantages of being unlimited ingest, being able to do it more real time, that's really what we believe will allow us to get the indicators of attack. And to us, if XDR cannot surface those kinds of things, then you should have just stayed with the SIEM. The challenge with the SIEM today, and if you look at it, right, even I'll give you the example of what we started with Preempt, Active Directory logs. Almost every organization we went to, they were not storing Active Directory logs. They could not justify the cost. They could not. And even with New York Department of Financial Services, NYDFS, their regulations around, hey, if you see an attack, you need to keep all the data for 5 years. Think of an organization that's not the big banks. How are they going to afford it? For 5 years? You talk about a financial institution with 2,500 employees. So when we went in there, the thing for them was, okay, we don't have this information, but at least can you collect the right information when you do see an incident became really important. So I think if XDR can solve that problem of ingest in a manner that's fast and can solve the scale challenges without cost, that's going to drive it. That's the business value: speed, scale, efficiency, flexibility, TCO. You use these phrases. We're gonna get past this phase where everybody's spending money without thinking about it here in the next 12 to 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be asked to justify the value we bring. And if we don't do that business value justification and prepare for it now, we're going to be stuck in a year or two.
Yep, I agree 100%. That makes sense as a way to delineate XDR from SIEM, primarily with a cost driver, but also with an efficiency driver, being able to store that unstructured data, but still get some utilization out of it. I think that's how we ended up in the mess that we're in with SIEM, is everybody ingested without thinking about what they were going to use the data for once they got it into the central location. I want to give you a chance to kind of justify one of the detractors from the most recent Gartner report, where CrowdStrike did extremely well. But one of the drawbacks was they said you didn't have an XDR story. They said you were lacking an XDR story. So how does the short-term roadmap with Humio combat that? I know you were talking about some of the things that are coming forward with Preempt and CrowdStrike and where that merger and integration is coming into fruition. What does that look like for Humio?
So the CrowdStrike customers don't come to CrowdStrike for a year, right? They're not buying one module or two modules and saying, we're done. And if you don't do the third one for me in a year, I'm going to walk away. A lot of them have seen this company go from 7 or 8 modules to 19 different modules. And innovation continues really fast. So I think that does not change. Even for me, as coming part of the Preempt, the integration is going so well that it tells me that the architecture is scalable. And so for our customers, they have confidence in us and we have confidence in them, right? And, Gartner, obviously they have to make the comments as they see the state of the industry. There's no doubt. But we have to look at our customers and say, okay, here's what we are planning to do. And many of them have faith. As you can see when financial results were announced, customers are buying more and more capabilities from the CrowdStrike platform. They're investing more. They are doing more with us. And I think that's what's going to drive. So there is definitely, without going into timelines, there's a lot of things that are upcoming really soon. So we will continue to innovate, and the XDR story, as it's relevant, will show up for our customers. And I think we're just as impatient as everyone else, right?
Yeah, immediate gratification is definitely a problem of this generation and anybody that sits in this industry. And when you look at the XDR story, does CrowdStrike view XDR as a thing or as a set of capabilities? And if so, what are some of those necessary capabilities to be considered XDR?
That's a good question, right? I think it goes back, and I think I don't know if I can completely and fully answer the question. So I'll tell you, I'm probably not the right person for that. But a lot of it has to do with our ability to say, if a customer sees a breach or if a customer wants some information, can they get it from a security viewpoint? That's really the underlying thesis of XDR for us. And so until, maybe I can follow up with something a little bit more detail, but I think that's really our underlying thesis is, if you have to get to some data, can you get to it fast? If you want to make a judgment, can you make that judgment quickly? Or does it mean that you have to go back and say, well, we don't have this data source, or it'll take us a day to process this data? Those are two non-negotiable things.
Actually, I like that answer, especially where CrowdStrike is positioned with their incident response team as well. You'll know better than anybody else if your product is working because your practitioners are going to be using it in the field.
Exactly, 100%. 100%, right.
So last thing I want to ask, is there anything you can tell us about the future product roadmap that you're excited about?
Oh, so much, right? This, as we've said, the capabilities that are coming out of the platform that we have today, the cloud capabilities that CrowdStrike announced about 12, 18 months ago, we're making those rich. CrowdStrike went from being an endpoint security company to building cloud workloads, to bringing identity, to bringing XDR. I mean, just building those out is going to bring so much value to our customers. So if our customers if we do those things well for our customers, that in itself will be amazing because it solves so many of their challenges. The cloud transformation is huge. Things we were thinking about doing 2 years out, enterprises were thinking about doing it 2 years or 3 years out. The pandemic accelerated. And so for us, being just able to help them solve those problems around cloud security, around zero trust, around XDR, That's really where the focus is.
Awesome. Great insight. Really appreciate the time and looking forward to seeing what CrowdStrike comes out with over the next 6, 12, and 18 months.
Thanks, Randy. We are too. This is an exciting time for us in security.
Thanks for joining, Ajit. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Be sure to follow us on all the socials so you can find out when part 2 drops of our Rated XDR series on Son of a Breach.